We'll start the formal business now, and I'd like to welcome our speaker, Anne Anderson. Anne's impressive credentials are already known to any of you who are members of the Art Society, and I can see many of you there now. She has a first degree in archaeology, a PhD in English. She was senior lecturer in art and design history at Southampton Solent for 14 years. She's curated exhibitions at Leighton House, other prestigious museums, and the Russell Coats, as we just heard. A book on the Perseus series was published for the Edwin Burne-Jones exhibition, and she's currently a tutor for the V&A Learning Academy. That's not bad, is it? Her career as an international speaker has taken her all over the world, including Europe, New Zealand, Canada, and the USA, as well as 4 tours of the art societies in Australia, and that's quite something. We're extremely fortunate and delighted to have her with us this evening. So over to you, Anne.
Thank you, June. And obviously I did meet June when she was chair, in fact, of what was NADFAS. In fact, I think I knew June before she was chair of NADFAS, or what is now the Art Society. Though many of us still, sort of get into the habit of calling it the NADFAS, National Association of Decorative Fine Arts Societies, now the Art Society. That's got that out of the way. So, as you probably heard from June, I have travelled extensively, but that also includes travelling extensively around Britain. So many of the slides that you're going to see are my own photographs. So it gives you a good idea that I work really hard in sort of tracking down arts and crafts and other unusual gardens. I'm not going to tell you about the garden at the bottom yet, except to tell you that it's just outside Wonash, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, at Godalming. And you can see I've actually put my logos on for Leatherhead and the Mole Valley Art Society, Art Live. So I've done my bit, as it were, for the community. Right, that's my first slide out of the way. Right, so I was just saying, yes, we'll hear more about this garden later, but you probably gathered from my byline, Idyllic Arts and Crafts Gardens, a sort of a haven in our troubled times. Well, my own garden, although very modest, you'll see it right at the end for a bit of fun, certainly has been a haven. We were very lucky in that lockdown came with an improvement in the weather, didn't it? And it seems to have been summer, really, from about mid-March through to September. But I don't know about where you are in Leatherhead, but today's been ghastly. It's been non-stop rain, it's turned really cold, and you can feel that winter is round the corner. So I'm hoping with my wonderful slides, mostly taken in high summer, to remind you of our summer that has only just gone. So this is the first garden in Surrey, designed by Gertrude Jekyll in collaboration with Lutyens, and we'll be hearing a bit more about it later. But it gives you immediately a good idea of the character of an arts and crafts garden. Very structured, lots of topiary, either box or yew, lots of what I would call English flowers, though the examples you're seeing here are in fact Asiatic lilies, but hollyhock, lupin, sunflowers. Jekyll obviously has a rose named in her honour, and we tend to sort of associate them with a certain sort of like Englishness. So the sort of arts and crafts garden also seems to me to speak of a sort of idyllic image of England before the Industrial Revolution. So, of course, the arts and crafts garden is nothing new. If we wanted to be pedantic about it, we would really call it the medieval garden. And we would be studying gardens sort of before 1500, when they often had to work as well as be attractive. The cottage garden often had a beehive, the flowers were to attract bees, and there would be a vegetable patch alongside the flowers. But the person who really boosted or created the concept, I think, of an arts and crafts garden is, you've probably guessed it already, William Morris. The garden that accompanied Red House, and Red House was completed in 1859. His architect was Philip Webb. Although the garden is only an echo of what it was in Morris's day, it's never been fully reconstructed. It has all of the elements in it that I think of as arts and crafts. It had wattle dividers. It had a hazel tunnel, rather like a pergola, but a natural one. And Morris was very keen to keep the orchard that was already on the site. There's a famous sort of myth about how Jane, his famous wife, could sit in the upstairs drawing room, and when the windows were open, ripe fruit would plop onto her lap from the fruit trees of the orchard just outside. Very romantic. The wishing well in the centre is purely ornamental. I know you're not supposed to say that about the arts and crafts. Everything's supposed to have a function, but in this case it was largely ornamental, and was, I think, Philip Webb imagining that Red House might have been in France. Nice idea. Now, Morris unfortunately had to give up Red House in 1865 for both health and financial reasons. Oh, just before we leave that, I should say that the garden at Red House inspired his earliest wallpapers. So this is Rose and Trellis, because again, it's sort of like scrambling wisteria, clematis and rose varieties. Climbers always make me think of the arts and crafts garden. So he had to give up at Red House, and there's a sort of lull before he gets Kelmscott Manor in 1871 on a joint lease, of course, with the infamous Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And this is actually by Maria Spartali Stillman. And it's just to show you that the garden at Kelmscott could also be classified as arts and crafts. It's already got Jekyll-esque borders. And in fact, you know, the concept of the big mixed border can again be tracked back to the Elizabethan period. So there's nothing new about the arts and crafts garden. It's reinvented for the late Victorian era. Amongst a generation that longed for an England that was past, an England that had not been, you know, despoiled by urbanisation and particularly the spread of the suburbs, you know, and also industrialisation. So it's literally looking back to the medieval and Elizabethan or Tudor Elizabethan period through rose-tinted spectacles. That's not Jane walking along the pathway. It might be Maria Spartali Stillman herself. So here is Kelmscott Manor. Don't go and visit at the moment. It's been closed for about the past 18 months, having a big, you know, regeneration programme. But you can see the roses here leading up to the doors. And my main reason for including Kelmscott is topiary. One of the defining elements in an arts and crafts garden is undoubtedly topiary. There were plenty of historic examples for them to look back to, like particularly Leven's Hall in Cumbria. And when I was asked, believe it or not, by the BBC to do a short piece on topiary, I couldn't resist on bringing in Morris's own topiary. So this is Fafnir. And in the Icelandic sagas, there's a sort of dragon known as Fafnir. And typically Morris cut his yew hedge into a sort of Fafnir, as you can see. It looks to me more like a beached whale than a dragon. And the top knot often looks a bit sad. But this is supposed to be, in topiary, Fafnir the dragon. And if I was going to pick, you know, one thing, it would be topiary. There's a lovely story of Rossetti, who, whilst wandering through, you know, the byways and highways of Buckinghamshire, came across a topiary armchair, sat in the, you know, the garden, front garden of a cottage, rather like the cottage we're looking at here. And he paid the owners of the cottage somewhere around 10 guineas to cut this topiary chair and take it back to Chelsea, where of course it promptly died. That's so typical of Rossetti. But we switch now to Birket Foster, and the paintings of the Cottage Gardens come before the gardens, because Birket Foster was capturing a sort of lost nostalgic image of England in the 1860s. And the cottage garden sort of really takes off as a cultural phenomena towards the end of the century, sort of 1880s, even the 1890s, and opening of the 20th century in the case of Jekyll and Lutyens. So we're here. Birket Foster he's not born in Surrey, but he spends most of his life in Surrey, and living at Whitley, as you'll see in a minute. And he'll build his own dream cottage at Whitley, which sadly is no longer with us. I would really love to have seen the hill. So before we leave this image, what I want you to particularly notice about Birket Foster's cottages is they're not pristine. They're often rather ramshackle. I mean, look at that roof and you know, the sort of general sort of antiquated element. This is before Surrey is overtaken by stockbrokers who come in via the train, buy up these cottages, gentrify them, and if you want to be sort of too harsh, rather spoil them. We'll meet Helen Allingham in a minute. She got so fed up with the gentrification that she had to keep leaded panes of glass in her studio to sort of paint them back into the cottages that had been renovated. Most importantly, if you're buying a Birket Foster or Helen Allingham, and you'll meet Helen in just a minute, make sure you buy one with a cat in it. It adds several £1000s to the value of the painting. Not a dog, but a cat. And you can see a peep through the sort of rather broken fence and gate here of the cottage garden itself. Cabbages, lupins. These are things that you can look for as we go through the images. So here he is. So his is the purpose-built house. It's rather grandiose, as you can see. Birket Foster was not an artist who was starving in his garret by any means, and at Whitley, and it's known as the Hill, on Wormley Hill. And he began to build this. In fact, most of it's completed by 1863, but he added to it. So he commissioned one of the first interiors from Morris & Co. So another nice link. But sadly, it is no longer with us. It was demolished in the 20th century. To me, it looks like it's sort of based on somewhere like Little Morton Hall, all that black and white half timbering. So here is where Birket Foster starts. So he made his name really as an illustrator. First of all, of what you and I would sort of call travel logs. He also illustrated quite a few novels. He's a Quaker by birth, which I always find incongruous with a career as an artist. Just I always think of them as being very down to earth. And his pictures of English landscape, as you can see, perhaps following in the traditions of Constable, are creating this image that we long for in the Victorian era: duck ponds, hay wains, cottages, and sort of this whole sort of conviviality of life in the countryside. These come first, and then he does so well with his illustrated travel logs, pictures of English landscape being the most famous, that he moves into painting watercolours. And watercolours had the advantage of being more affordable than oils, and they were also quicker to produce. And by the end of his career, he was actually charging a guinea to authenticate one of his watercolours, because there were so many people out there trying to sort of cash in on his style and his reputation. So I'm showing you another black and white image from pictures of English landscape, and you can see how that was easily converted into a watercolour entitled Peeling Potatoes, where our young girl, again please note the addition of the cat, the kitten, is peeling potatoes outside one of these, again in this instance not too ramshackle cottage, but you can see the lattice panes behind her, the cottage garden with primula and primroses to the right hand side, and what appear to be cabbages in the foreground. And there are certainly cabbages in the foreground of the image from pictures of English landscape, because the cottage garden by definition had to have this sort of element that it was a practical utilitarian garden, not just a flower garden. Even the flowers were there for the bees. So as I was putting this together, I did my best to find very specifically Surrey images, and that's not as easy as it sounds, because in the end Birket Foster found it easier to create generic images that could be sold to a London urban based clientele who just really wanted a fantasy of England before the Industrial Revolution. So here we are getting water from the pond. There's grazing sheep in the background, though this is supposed to be at Hambledon. I don't think it looks like that today, but you may be able to tell me otherwise. With the cottage just a component in the background. And this is also supposed to be at Sandhole Lane, Hambledon. And this one's actually in the Tate. And again, there's a sort of interesting bit of sort of social history going on here. Our mother, who appears to have stopped to feed or to comfort the baby, is accompanied by her children. She's been out gathering wood. We've got some interesting chickens in the foreground. Again, it's the whole idea of a working countryside, not a pleasure park. And there is not that much thatch in Surrey, even in the 19th century. And in fact, when Helen Allingham comes along, a lot of the thatch has indeed disappeared. And she frequently went down to Dorset to paint thatched roofs. But obviously, they have an obvious picturesque quality. Indeed, all of this grows out of the picturesque movement, which has been flourishing in terms of English gardens since the late 18th century. So this is the Cottage Gardens. It's generic, but when I look at it, I think always that it looks rather like an inn. I think it's that large sign in the background. So here is a young lady, or perhaps not so young, but she's definitely picking cabbages. And I love the way the washing is hung out on the left-hand side, and as sort of sprawls over what appears to be a sort of lean-to that's now falling apart. Again, emphasising that these are cottages that have seen better days, could be improved with some renovation, you might say, but they all have this sort of idea that they are very much working buildings. So the cutting of the cabbages sits alongside the flowers in the garden. And that motif, it could be the same woman, couldn't it, picking cabbages here and about to put them in her truckle. And she's been joined, as you can see, by her children in the garden with, again, the usual, it becomes almost like formulaic. The cottage garden with the cottage in the background, with the rather decayed roof, with all those lichens and mosses, and obviously the lattice panes, which are rapidly disappearing. And you can see a rather sort of straggly cottage garden. So again, it's a sort of this idea of being a little unkempt. I think those are courgettes, if I'm not wrong, or marrows, I should say, growing in the foreground alongside the cabbages. And you get the impression that people were really not clued in as to what life in the countryside was really like. I mean, after the age of 9, many children no longer went to school. They went straight into working in factories if they were urban based. And a lot of country children never went to school in the first place. They were needed to work the land. Very young children were often used to scare the crows. They had those things like football, sound, things that you rattles, and they would be sent out into the fields to frighten away all of the birds. So, this idea of coming home from school in this sort of magic landscape, complete, as you can see, with a cottage with sunflowers, is exactly that. It's an imaginary landscape of very clean children coming out of school, returning home, and this was designed very much for a Victorian urban elite who didn't want to be troubled with the real hardship of living in the countryside. So you can see here what I mean about transferring sort of middle-class lifestyle to a country setting. I mean, there wasn't time to sit around the tea table in a working Victorian farm, as you can see here, these pristine children with their pinafores. And all of these artists kept a period costume in their studio, particularly mop caps, which again could give the illusion that you were looking at the 1820s or 1830s rather than the 1870s. So again, it was all a bit fraudulent from that point of view. And here we are having this lovely tea party, as you can see, in bright sunshine. There's our garden. It's now looking, in fact, much more fulsome, isn't it? With some hollyhock. I can definitely spot some poppies and some pansies right down the bottom. And I'm not a botanist, so I'll do my best. But they had favourites. So you might just see creeping up the wall nasturtiums. That was a particular favourite. And of course, you can eat them as well as enjoy their appearance. Please notice the importance of the cats. Helen Allingham therefore comes on the heels of Birket Foster, and she marries relatively late in life the poet William Allingham. And one of the problems for Helen was that she couldn't be seen to be earning more than her husband. My husband's never had that problem. And she'd already had, like Birket Foster, a very lucrative career. I'm just omitting somebody. She'd already had a very lucrative career drawing and producing illustrations, particularly of society, like going to the theatre. She'd worked for several very important magazines, like the Illustrated London News. But once she got married, she was rather forced to look for alternative means of making a living, because although her husband was very talented as a poet, and also edited Fraser's magazine, he didn't actually earn that much. So she turned to watercolour. Rather like Birket Foster, it was a good medium to turn to. It was more affordable, and it was a private income. It wasn't sort of splashed out as it would have been if she was working for illustrated magazines. She marries the poet William Allingham in 1874. Allingham was very well connected, not only to the sort of pre-Raphaelite circle, but also to Tennyson. And it may well have been Tennyson's proximity, he lived also in this area of Surrey, at Blackdown, that prompted the Allinghams to look for somewhere in this vicinity. We're back to Wormley. Oh, hang on, sorry, I've just lost my cursor. Hang on a second, it's hiding down there. Oh yeah, before we leave that image, please note the cat. And we've got a portrait by Helen of William Allingham, and then two images of Helen herself when she's relatively young and then older in life. And again, this is a very nice image of Shear, because of course originally they start to sort of come to the area on holiday before settling. So this is a rather, again, an idyllic image, isn't it, of Shear, painted by Helen Allingham in 1878. Her maiden name is Patterson, by the way, and one of her sisters also becomes a very well-known watercolour artist, but we'll stick with Helen. They actually lived near Wickley from 1881 to 1886, when they had to move back into town, largely because of William Allingham's failing health. But she still went forth to paint cottages, but she meant to Pinner, that's near Harrow, to paint. And she might have returned to Surrey as a weekend painter, but of course she had lots of sketches. And again, like Birket Foster, her images become rather formulaic and rather anonymous. So this is where they lived, and it will be taken over after they leave it in 1888 by Graham Robertson, another figure very much in the thick of the arts and crafts and extended aesthetic movement. William Graham Robertson, if I've got the initials the right way around. Actually, I think it's Graham William Robertson. He hated the fact his initials sounded like a railway. So again, it's not easy to find specifically named works which will actually give you the exact location in Surrey. But this one, which is in the V&A, and that's the reason why it's not framed, is said to be a cottage at Chiddingfold. So the other way that artists could work at this time, so I'm showing you a Francis Frith, very famous photographer, who went around all of England photographing old buildings. If you were a weekend painter or you wanted an aid to your memory, you could use these photographs, and Francis Frith was the obvious person that you turn to. So Old Cottages at Chiddingfold becomes very well known for its, its old world charm. And the Old Crown Inn at Chiddingfold, this is a bit of a later postcard, but postcards were really useful for artists to help them construct their fantasy of the Surrey countryside. By the time we get into the 1870s and 80s, it really is becoming a commuter area, and a lot of the houses are being demolished for people like Richard Norman Shaw, to build new ones, or Voysey building arts and crafts houses, and many of the existing houses are being gentrified. So again, Helen kept those leaded panes in her studio so she could reinsert them into a renovated building. So a lot of them are simply described as a Surrey cottage. I particularly like this one, not only because it has our inevitable cat, but because they look like they're waiting for somebody, don't they? They look like they're looking for the father to come home. And a lot of the figures, particularly in Allingham, they're quite small. And in a way, they're sort of there to create scale for the size of the landscape and the cottage. I love the ducat in the background. And please note, if you're going to have a proper cottage garden, you've got to have some sunflowers. They were very much emblematic of the 1870s and 1880s, when the aesthetic movement was at its height. For those of you who are familiar with the Victorian language of flowers, you will be pleased to know that from Clytie, the sunflower means hopeless longing and unfulfilled desire. So for most Victorians, the sunflower simply represented desire. So I'm not sure these are at Chiddingfold, but what I wanted to show you is this, Helen Allingham was very attracted to the sort of what becomes known as the Surrey vernacular. So that's particularly the tile hanging, which has got scalloped as well as rectangular elements to it, as you can see, like the pan tiles from Tunbridge Wells, very famous. They liked, if I can just go back quickly, things like the hipped roof line. That's here, if my cursor works, actually showing you the hipped gable, the tall brick chimneys, the half timbering. They liked all these aspects that become known as vernacular architecture, which means building in local materials and in local styles. So I'm not sure that that's not the exact cottage in Chiddingfold, but that gives you an idea of the veracity of these images which capture these cottages which are now disappearing. And in fact, both William Allingham and Helen were very active in the newly formed Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, another of William Morris's enterprises, because they were very alarmed at the way these buildings were either being, inappropriately restored or simply swept away. Valewood Farm, Hazelmere, was one of the Allingham's favourites. It's referred to as a cottage. I would not refer to it as a cottage. It's what we refer to as a yeoman farmer's abode. And it was very much in danger of being ruined by the doer-uppers. So that's what it looks like. And in fact, you'll find it recorded in Country Life a couple of times. I think that's a photograph of about 10, 15 years ago that I found. And this is what it looks like in one of Helen Allingham's watercolours. So I think you'll agree with me, it's not exactly a cottage, is it? It's a bit more upmarket than that. But please note the repetition of these elements, the ducks, the mother holding the baby, and she's sort of again wearing costume that's at least 30 or 40 years out of date in terms of her bonnet, and that fantastic garden with its tall blooms. I can see some hollyhock and some sunflowers. Love it. There was a particularly avid collector of Allingham's cottages. It was Mr. Marley, who had the famous company Marley Tiles. He put together a really impressive collection of William Allingham's cottages, but they were only, not the thatched ones, only the ones with the tile roofs. In the late 80s, they went around the country on exhibition. And then very cleverly, Mr. Marley sold them all at Christie's. We're talking here 1990, and this particular one near Whitley is well, they actually, what Christie's did was they went and identified as closely as they could all the cottages, and this one made the top price in 1990 of, that's 43,000. Sorry about the extra note. 43,000, showing you how judicious it is to actually identify the cottage if you can. There she is again. She's followed us. There she is standing at the gate with her child, with looking at the mother hen with the chicks, and the same flowers, the hollyhock and the sunflowers in the garden. And again, that rather lovely ramshackled cottage in the background. Helen had 3 children. She wasn't very fond of her daughter Evie, who I'm afraid was rather pushed into the background and forgotten. But she was very fond of her 2 sons. And although Harry is, yes, the baby that you see here, appears to be wearing a dress, remember that in the Victorian era, boys were dressed in dresses, God, that's tautological, until they were like 3 or 4, or even older, and then they were breeched, as it's so delightfully put. So don't be alarmed. Looking at Victorian paintings, you might well be confused that the girls turn out to be boys. And this is a really lovely image, as you can see, in terms of picking out your flowers. There's that eponymous cat, who's, I've got a close-up of him, as you can see, because he's rather lovely, isn't he? But that also allows us to get a good close-up of the flowers. And when I first saw this, I thought, you know, Jekyll had designed it for them in terms of the English flowers and the red hot poker border. You know, there's bright orange flowers all nestling on the left-hand side. There's our cabbages again, to emphasize these are working gardens, and the rather ramshackle cottage in the background. And my close-up shows you what appears to be pansies, and an unusual juxtaposition, because as we're going to discover with Jekyll, it's all about colour and using the colour wheel to make very obvious contrasts. So on the colour wheel, you know, orange and yellow goes opposite purple and blue. So this is Brook in Surrey, and you can virtually, I think, identify, if you're a good florist, most of the things that you're looking at here, but I can certainly again pick out delphiniums and pansies in the foreground. And that leads us very nicely into Miss Jekyll herself. Now, obviously, she's a local girl, as by the way is Lutyens. He's actually a Surrey lad, and her boots here are depicted by William Nicholson, and they were in the recent Royal Academy exhibition on painted gardens. She gets many of her ideas from William Robinson, who'd already published the English Flower Garden, which very much again brought back the fashion for what you and I would think of as English blooms, but also this idea of how you would structure a garden with a formal area near the house and then getting wilder as you move away. There's a photograph at the top of her looking slightly myopic with a spade, and that's not at Munstead, I don't think. That's not the right wall behind, but it's to show you that she was very much hands-on in terms of her gardening, especially once at Munsteadwood, her famous house in Surrey, had been completed. And looking at this black and white photograph of her, you wouldn't argue with her, would you? And this is Helen Allingham's rather, again, beautiful depiction of one of the borders at Munstead. Oh, it's Munstead House, so that's not Munsteadwood. That is the house that is created by Lutyens for Gertrude Jekyll, which you'll see in just a minute. And you can see her birth and death dates at the top to give you some parameters. She began really as an artist and only really moved into gardening when her eyesight began to fail. She was also very gifted with a needle, which is more than I can say for myself. And she was very involved in the suffrage movement, not the suffragettes, but the suffragists. And you can see one of her embroideries for the suffragist movement if you go to visit Godalming. It's their banner for the Godalming Lady Suffrage Societies. Marches. Oh, I love it. I love it. And that's, I think, has also got quite a few other mementos of Gertrude Jekyll. So next comes Sir Edwin Landseer, because I'm going to concentrate very much on Jekyll and Landseer working. So yes, word Lutyens. Why did I put Landseer at the top there? That's a good spoonerism. Very much a combination of the two working together. So Edwin Lutyens. He grows up at Thursley in Surrey. Then he joins the architectural practice of Ernest George and Harold Peto. In that collaboration, it is Harold Peto who is the famous gardener. There's Iford Manor, which is his own personal garden, but you might have also come across his Italianate garden at Buscott. So there's definitely an Italian element now creeping into the English arts and crafts garden. He sets up on his own as a very young man in 1888 and meets Jekyll shortly after. The legend has it that Gertrude was out in her dog cart and sort of perambulating along a Surrey lane when she spotted the young Lutyens sketching. And what you're looking at in terms of the garden here is Goddard's, the home now of the Lutyens Society. 1898 to 1900 is the date of Goddard's. And the garden is really more, as you can see, an architectural element. And it was created originally as a respite, for genteel ladies who were needing a holiday. And so you could imagine our genteel ladies might have come out sort of just literally to sit around the sundial. Might have a different, yes, here we are, to sit around this paved area with lots of sort of like small rockery type plants. Might have been designed for them to sit in the sun, because immediately behind here, if my cursor is working, is the communal dining room. So Goddard's began as this sort of philanthropic endeavour, a sort of respite for genteel ladies, but then it was it was converted into a home for the eldest son of the family. So it has a complicated history. That's what I'm probably trying to put over. Right, so one of the things that changes at the end of the 19th century in terms of our painters is the type of gardens they appreciated. So we've seen that Allingham and Birket Foster very much concentrates on this sort of like small cottage garden that is part flower and very obviously a working garden. But at the end of the 19th century and very much in the Edwardian period, we get lots of artists like George Samuel Elgood, who's actually from Leicester, concentrating on bigger gardens. So he and Ernest Arthur Rowe very much concentrate on the gardens that you and I would associate with the big houses of the National Trust. So I wanted to choose some that were local. So this obviously is Loseley, and you're seeing the garden parterres as they have been reconstructed, the front of Loseley Hall, and then by Samuel Elgood, as he's usually referred to, an example, as you can see, of one of the Jekyll-esque borders, some of the cut topiary, and most importantly, the cat that always improves the value of these watercolours. So that's Loseley. They were equally fond of this garden, which is Great Tangley Manor. Great Tangley Manor is like Loseley, is an ancient house, going back to the Elizabethan period or even further, but had fallen into disrepair, and Philip Webb came along for the Flower family who owned it and beautifully renovated it. So this is Ernest Arthur Rowe's image of the sort of covered bridge at Great Tangley Manor. This is another water that's near Wonash. I hope I'm pronouncing these local names correctly. This is by Anna Brewster. But, I wanted you to see how idyllic these gardens are. By the way, you can hire Great Tangley Manor. I can't afford to myself, but it's available for private hire, particularly things like weddings and special parties, you know, like silver weddings, etc. I love this guy sitting in the garden reading his newspaper, and the inevitable, and you can never get away from them in a Lutyens garden, sundial. I love the dog as well. So it hasn't changed much, has it? So I'll do that for you again. So this is the Edwardian watercolour, and this is what it looks like today. So I'm pleased to report that it's hardly changed. And of course, Philip Webb, remember, architect of Red House, is a very sympathetic restorer, but he also added some rather colourful elements. So it has a moat around it, always useful. And he constructed this fantastic covered walkway that extends right from the front of the house over the moat, and was really popular amongst watercolour artists, you can imagine. Had a sort of almost like French feel to it. These are from their website, as I've never had, and I really wish I had, the opportunity to visit Great Tangley Manor. We're looking across the moat and the lake. On the top you can see the bridge, well, in fact the lake is in the foreground, the moat is beyond, and the bridge in my bottom left-hand image is showing the bridge over the moat, and this is the walled garden immediately behind it. And on the right-hand side, we've got the very Jekyll-esque, as you can see, herbaceous border, which runs alongside this covered walkway, which extends out over the moat itself, as you can see, creating an incredibly picturesque feature, which is usually attributed to Philip Webb. And this is George Elgood again. This is the pergola. Now, if you want to recreate an arts and crafts garden, you need a pergola. I don't have room. I'm very sad. I don't have room for a pergola. I don't really have room for the topiary. But you can see here that, you know, one of the essential ingredients is the pergola, over which scramble all of your, you know, trailing flowers. And obviously you need the herbaceous borders too. And this, the lily borders here must be after Jekyll by Thomas Hung. But it's just to show you how artists were now looking for bigger gardens. You know, we've gone up a notch. We've gone away from those modest cottage gardens to the big gardens, or to the magnificent gardens associated with large country estates like Loseley and Great Tangley Manor. Which brings me properly, of course, to the relationship between Lutyens, got the name right on the slide, I hope this time, and Gertrude Jekyll. And we started with Chinthurst. Again, if I've said that wrong, I do apologise, at Wannish, which is again very close to Great Tangley Manor. One is one side of the road, one is on the other, in the Surrey Hills. This is a very young Lutyens, built between 93 and 95. It was his first collaboration. The owners sell it very shortly after it's created. That's Maggie Guthrie. She sells it quite quickly to Lord Rendell, who also happens, by the way, to own Hatchlands, which is the reason why he will bring Lutyens and Jekyll in, or particularly Jekyll, to reconfigure the garden at Hatchlands. More recently, the wonderfully named, and I'm sure you'll recognise the name, Mrs. Graham Bonham Carter, lived at Chinthurst for about 18 years. And they've only recently sold it. I don't know what they got for it. I do apologise. But I now know it has now changed hands. These therefore come from Rightmove, which, because again, it's a very private house. So Chinthurst was designed by Jekyll, as you can see, his lovely quote, to have something of the convent about it. The gardens were a retreat, and they, you know, they are small and they are intimate and close to the house. They are very formal, as you can see here, with Lutyens providing the architectural structure and Jekyll supplying the planting. So Chinthurst. So this is Hatchlands for Lord Rendell, and he bought Chinthurst for one of his dowager relatives. So second house is what I'm trying to say. And this is the reconstructed formal garden at Hatchlands, National Trust property, as you know. And again, it's this idea of sort of bringing back the parterres that I associate very much with the Baroque garden, i.e. gardens of the 17th century. Here's a better view of the, again, the sort of layout. So dwarf block box hedges were suffering very much from box dieback. It's a major problem for these gardens, but they create a structure. Nile lilies, as you can see here, again, are very popular in these Edwardian gardens. So Jekyll's own home, and I've always been rather amused by this, in the sense that, you know, Jekyll never married and never had children, and yet she has this huge house at Munstead, and she had a special sort of element, well, a special nest built for the owls in the loft of Munsteadwood. I rather like that idea. And we know her work so well, not only from her gardens, but also from her publications. So Some English Gardens is 1904 in date. I'd be quite happy with the gardener's house, which you can see here. And this is also just to remind you that one of the reasons that these gardens are so beautiful is there was no shortage of labour. They are very labour-intensive gardens. All that clipping of those box hedges and all that pruning of those roses and keeping the whole thing sort of untidily, it has to be untidy, but, you know, nevertheless, it's like a sort of nonchalance that is cultivated. And this is the gardener's cottage at Munsteadwood, which was completed by Lutyens in 1898. I'd be very happy with that. Now, walking around Munsteadwood, every single one of the facades is different. We're now at the back. So the front is all local bar stone. And now we're around the back, we've got a half-timbered gallery, which is structural. His half-timbering is not fake, which is one of the things I dislike about some of the faux arts and crafts houses of this era. But Lutyens' timber work is structural and a sort of wishbone shape, as you can see here. And the thing about these gardens is they have lots of little elements tucked away. So here's a watercolour by Thomas Hunn, in this case, of the back of Munsteadwood, showing you the steps. Not a lot has changed, has it? Lilies, etc. in the watercolour. But what you can't see is the sort of concealed water feature known as the tank garden, which I confess I have borrowed from the internet. So there are lots of sort of little secret surprises. You know, you pop round a corner and you go, oh, I wasn't expecting to find a pond or a little fountain. So here in the courtyard, you know, at the back of the house is the so-called tank garden. And I'm showing you this view of the back of the house. You can see the tank garden, or the tank garden, and the water. It's got netting over it. I think there's a local heron problem. But this is the back of Munstead. It allowed Gertrude in and out of her garden. It was also specially designed for her to arrange her cut flowers, but she also sold cut flowers. And that was evidently a very important part of her income, that she was actually sending flowers to market. So all of this, you know, was a working space at the back of the garden for floral arrangements, cut flowers, and flowers being sent to market. So again, perhaps it emphasises that these gardens are not just ornamental, they also have very obvious function to them as well. And the idea in Jekyll Garden is to have, you know, it's all about colour. She's got the eye of a painter, and these are all period photographs of her garden at Munstead, showing you how it was planted in her lifetime, with lupins, delphiniums, irises. I'm sure you can recognise all of them. But again, using the colour wheel, she liked to plant blue and silver and white together. So we're looking here at the grey garden, called that because most of its plants had grey foliage. You should also plant in sequence, so there was always some colour to be seen in the garden. I remember going to Buscott Park and being told by Lord Farrington it's very important to have a Jekyll blousy border. do like that idea. This is the so-called hut at Munsteadwood. In fact, I think originally it was one of the exterior buildings. It's more like a medieval great barn, doesn't it? But the important thing is you can see it here. This is it in country life. This is the hut in the background with that spread of flowers, and here as it looks today. And this is a very beautiful watercolour of, in fact, Jekyll planning a border, and this is was on show at Hestercombe, which I think is Jekyll's finest garden. You'll see it in just a minute. There are those delphiniums in the background. So yes, lots of tall structural plants, very deep borders, as you can see, a sort of nonchalance about them that looks like it's uncontrived, but is clearly, as we've seen in this watercolour, very carefully planned. And then the idea was to have hot colours, so you would build up from yellow to bright orange in the centre. You'd have stepping stones inserted, by the way, in these deep borders to allow you access towards the back. And this again is just to remind you is a Munsteadwood painted by Helen Allingham, to show you again how the gardens achieved fame through these illustrated books. And this is the Pansy garden at Munsteadwood. And again, the idea was to have very formal gardens close to the house, and then they went wilder into woodland as you moved away. There was also a nut walk. I'll show you one of those in just a minute. Moving on very quickly, because I'm already running out of time and covering a lot of ground, literally. Orchards was next door to Munsteadwood and was the Chance family home. Another magnificent house by Lutyens. And again, sometimes you sort of feel the architecture almost takes over here in the Dutch garden at Orchards. This is one of the Chance's nieces sitting with this inevitably charming black kitten. And the Dutch garden here is a link to the Dutch garden at Hestercombe, which is in Somerset, which I think it's still my favourite Jekyll garden. It's most famous for its Grand Plat, this enormous sunken garden. You see here what I mean about structure and about planting the same colours together, swathes moving from blue to red, the most wonderful pergola, which in May is to die for, covered in wisteria. And the building, the house is nothing. It was wrecked by the Somerset Fire Brigade, but the garden is magnificent. And it also has one of these things, a rill. Lutyens was very fond of these rills. And again, I've got some continuity here. So this is the rill at Hestercombe. And this is the Chance's other home, which is in fact in West Sussex, and was a doer-upper. It's not entirely a Lutyens house. It's an Elizabethan Jacobean manor house, which was done up for them by Lutyens, but it comes complete, as you can see, with the Lutyens rill running up towards the conservatory. That's Lee, here it is, Lee Manor. I haven't misspelt that, I promise you. That's actually how it looks. They're greedy, this lot, aren't they? They haven't just got the one house in Surrey, Orchards. Now, the Chance family also had to have another house in Sussex. And one that's recently again changed hands is Ruckman's. I particularly wanted to include this because part of the Mole Valley Festival is a short film taking you around the gardens at Ruckman's, which we are all hoping is still there for you to have a look at over the weekend. They were due to take it down, but it should still be available for you to have a walk around the garden at Ruckman's. It's a very large estate, and again, I was able to nick these images. I haven't been to visit. I took these again off Rightmove. I do apologise for my voyeurism. And this is from for the Lyle family. So it's an existing building, and it was done up in 1894 and then extended in 1902. And I'm going to finish with two gardens that I know more intimately. Van, which Mary Carrow, as you know, very, very sad, was taken from us by COVID earlier this year. I was mortified to hear it. I'd only just met her last summer, taking 2 parties to Van. Lovely lady. She was a stalwart, you know, the type that ran the British Empire. She took us round valiantly, even though she was still working in her new knee. And Van has been in the Carrow family. He's an arts and crafts architect, you know, since her, hang on, it would be 2 or 3 generations back. So it would be her great-father, hang on, not her father, I think it might be her father-in-law, might be that I've got my generations wrong, bought Van, and then they began a long process again of restoring it. But being a true arts and crafts architect, Van is authentically restored, very much in the spirit of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, though there were 1 or 2 features that might make the diehard raise his eyebrows up and down. You still have to live in these houses, remember. So this is the front of Van. And then we're moving around to, this is how you enter the garden today. 1907 to 1908 is the date of the initial restoration. And as you can see, the profusion of flowers is impressive, and you've got, you know, timber, you know, the cladding, the timber cladding is very typically Surrey style, Surrey vernacular. And then we are looking the other way, so the building is now behind me. You can see some of the Jekyll Lutyens brick pathways, the beautifully clipped topiary, and again the idea is like at Hidcote to have in effect garden rooms. So we're moving round. I'm going to sort of swing you round the side of the house. This is the oldest section, I understand, of Van in terms of its architecture, and we're swinging round now to the main garden side, and you can see it has a wonderful sort of ramshackle feel to it that Carrow has not spoilt with his restoration. The things that that may be Mary down there, I guess it is, looking pensive. And one of the things that I really wanted from Van was, you've guessed it, the pergola. Look at the tile hanging. The pergola itself is a riot, as you can see, and we're looking along it now, rather like the pergola. Now, the elements at Van that we know is definitely Jekyll is the water garden, which you'll see in a minute, but it's very much a Jekyll-esque garden in terms of its planting and its design. When you get to the end of the pergola, you have the lake. And then this is looking back towards the house. At the top of the pergola is this rather nice sort of purpose-built area designed for you to have tea and get the vista down the pergola. And then this is looking across the lake at the house and the pergola with the rather nice sculpture of glass balls. And then this is looking along the long border, and what you're not quite, probably it's concealed, is you're looking at water. So there's a rill, but it's not the rill that we saw at Hestercombe or at Lee Manor. It's this riot of planting over the rill, which is much more obviously naturalistic. Here's a side view of it. Those at U's, rather. So this is what you do with your railway sleepers. And please look at what look like sofas made out of yew in the background. This is a lovely idea. Underneath the benches, you can see all these glass bottles. They're all the bottles of champagne and wine that the Carrow family have got through over the years. And they were used to create the base for these rather nice benches. Quite like that idea, the sort of sitting on your party. And this is when you sat, you know, the idea of these gardens, again, rooms and vistas. So this is another of these garden rooms at Van. Now we're looking the other way, where we are seeing a very beautiful, again, arbour at the end with a Jekyll bench. So it's a Lutyens bench. It's a very famous design by Lutyens, which pops up in lots of Jekyll gardens. There are my Nile lilies. And the link here is my last garden, because I'm also very fond of this, though I've strayed into my county, Hampshire, We're now at Upton Gray, another absolutely beautiful garden in the Jekyll style. This is looking at it again. This is Rosemary Wallinger's garden. It's very close to Basingstoke, beautifully restored. Again, it's this idea of garden rooms, very clearly structured. I was there in the height of summer, last summer, I'm afraid. Canna plants, rambling roses. There's my husband in the background taking a photo of me. That's quite amusing. A riot of hollyhock and lupins when I was there last August. Hopefully you're getting some inspiration for your own gardens. And yes, it's quite a riot, as you can see, of colour in August. And the inevitable big herbaceous border with my lupins, my delphiniums and my hollyhocks, and the sunflower in the centre. Sorry, not the sunflower, the sundial, going too fast. And I promised you a sort of nut walk, because that was a very important element in Jekyll's own garden at Munstead. And we're nearly there. And again, the all-important idea of having some sort of arbour over which things can scrabble. Right, we're almost at the end, and I'm hoping this will work. Keep your fingers crossed for me. My very modest garden. But I have to say that with the pandemic, and it became my little sanctuary. So it may be very modest, but it meant a lot to me that we bought the sculpture that we've always wanted to buy. And she's right next to my very modest arbour. And I hope that you too have a garden, or had a garden, that you could escape to during the worst of the pandemic in the summer. I've covered a lot of ground. Oh, hang on, my fault. But I thought I would just leave you with some lovely quotes. The love of gardening is a seed once sown that never dies. These are all Jekyll quotes. The lesson I have thoroughly learnt and which to pass on to others is to know the enduring happiness that the love of a garden gives. This is particularly for me. There is no spot of ground, however arid, bare or ugly, that cannot be tamed into such a state as may give an impression of beauty and delight. Here's me again. A woman's place is in the garden, and a garden is a grand teacher. It teaches patience, careful watchfulness. It teaches industry and thrift. Above all, it teaches entire trust. And Audrey Hepburn, who I'm very fond of, to plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow. And believe you me, looking at the news, well, let's hope that we can believe in tomorrow. So thank you very much for your patience. And if you want to find out more about me, you can find me on my website. So that's ann-anderson.com, where I am currently posting lots of short blogs about the Russell coats in particular.
Well, thank you, Anne. That was absolutely fabulous. All those wonderful images, and many of them absolutely on our doorstep. I mean, I could actually walk to Hatchlands, well, practically, and they were absolutely superb. Thank you so much. And particularly, I should think a lot of those familiar. We've got members of the Surrey Gardens Trust with us today, so they will be, I'm sure, even more familiar than I am with many of those gardens. To a fact, Anne, you did mention Muckmans and Goddard's, and if anybody would like to see more of the film of those, Rod Shaw is there somewhere, and he heads up the Heritage Open Days team, and he's arranged that the Heritage Open Days talks are going to stay online for another week. So they're all interesting talks on there. Specifically, there's Goddard's and Muckmans, I know specifically that you've mentioned. And there's a lovely one about the Deep Dean, as you showed us. I mean, some of those images, you know, some of the houses have disappeared, but thank goodness I've got paintings to show us what they were like. So you can actually go online, Mill Valley Heritage Open Days, and you can see all those films for another week. Also, if you go to the Mill Valley website, there's lots of other things in the Mill Valley Arts eLive this year. So there are lots of different forms of arts. If you go onto the website, you can find those. So I'd like to welcome all and thank all the LCA members who've supported us tonight, because it's so difficult for us to do things. And also for the other organisations we've got around us, like the Art Society, in Leatherhead and Dorking and other places in Moe Valley. We've got people here from the U3A, a lot of people here from Surrey Gardens Trust. So the rest of the community, it's great that we've all come together and it's something that interests us all. And you have really given us a wonderful overview. And it's amazing how you managed to keep it into Surrey, because you must be so tempted to go much further afield. And Anne's written especially for us, so we're hugely grateful, Anne. And this has been a wonderful start for us for the Arts Alive. If you'd like to unmute yourself.